Hi guys, Ollie here from On Your Game Physiotherapy. Today I'm going to be talking to you a bit about injury versus being hurt, what the difference is, why I think there's a clouded area between the term injury and the term hurt, and we're going to go on to what can be done to better the health of athletes moving forward. And the way I think we're going to do this best is by trying to avoid these two terms. But first of all, I just want to speak to you about what they are and why it's important to speak about it. So I physio for a lot of rugby clubs, and recently I've been getting a lot of coaches try to tell me that the player's fine to continue. This is like a really slippery slope to go down, because when we look at a team, we need to have a really successful triangle, which is basically physio at the top, coach and player either side. And my job as a physio is to make sure that everyone is in their best health and everyone can continue playing to the best of their abilities. So the best way that works is by me communicating to a player that they can't continue, and the coach understanding that that's my role and they are not okay to continue. But what happens is there's this distinction that coaches and players make between they are just hurt rather than they're actually injured. So let's say we're in a sporting environment, we're watching a game of rugby, and a player was to go down. The first thing I'm doing as a physio is I'm watching my surroundings, I'm seeing the whole game, I'm sort of looking out for the mechanism of injury to begin with. So, let's say it was to be a rolled ankle. I'm seeing that straight away, and my first port of call is to see what the injury was. So there, we've seen that there's a rolled ankle. I've come onto the pitch. The first thing I'm doing is I'm observing the situation. So I'm next to the player. What am I looking for? The first thing is going to be any initial swelling, okay? So one of the big factors which can differentiate between hurt and injury is we look at, swelling to begin with. If there's immediate swelling there, we know it's going to be something serious, especially at the ankle. Obviously, there's lots of ligaments there, there's lots of different tendons. So we're going to try and spot that if we can to begin with. The next thing we're going to do is I'm going to take them through a few tests. So I'm going to get their foot, I'm going to put it through range of movement. So we'll go through dorsiflexion, which is bringing the foot up, and then we'll do plantar flexion, which is bringing the foot down. If there's an injury at the foot, usually we won't be able to get full range of movement there. And when we've got that, we can then move on to doing our muscle testing as well. So then we'll look to do the same sort of movements, but I'll put a bit of pressure through it. And if they have loss of muscular function, that's another telltale sign for me that it's an injury. So what we're looking at is basically any sign that there's something more sinister happening there. But what tends to happen is, because players want to continue due to something that we call sport ethic, which I'll get onto in a bit, they will tend to lie during the tests. We see this mostly as physios in terms of head injury. So with a concussion, obviously it's much harder to spot the signs because they will try and avoid it at all costs. The players would want to stay on the pitch. So when we're looking at concussion, it's going to be slightly different for us. We're going to look at different modalities, so they'll be wobbly on their feet, if they can't get to their feet, how long they've been down for, if they're struggling to look at you. Obviously we'll do an eye test. Hearing can be sometimes impaired as well. But the reason I'm talking to you guys about being injured versus being hurt is because lots of players want to try and avoid being injured. There's a big stigma around the word injury. And what this means is lots of more serious injuries can happen as a result. So if we look at concussions now, there's something that we call secondary concussion syndrome, which basically means if you have two concussions within a really short space of time, for instance, in one game, it can literally be a matter of life and death because the brain can't take that much punishment. And there's been players who have died from it before. And what I'll find is I will tell a coach that there's a serious head injury here, we need to take him off the pitch. Or I'll tell the player, you need to come off the pitch. And they don't want to come off, obviously. So it's very important to have these sort of discussions where we can talk about what is serious enough to come off the pitch for. And I think when we talk about rugby specifically, there's been massive strides that have been made in terms of rehabilitation initially from the injury. we look at something called the HIA, the Head Injury Assessment. Basically, rugby's implemented this system where, in modern day rugby, where as soon as a head injury occurs, that player has to go off the pitch so we can perform more testing on them, better testing. Obviously, when we're in a game situation, we've only got 1 or 2 minutes to decide whether they need to come off the pitch or not. And usually for head injuries, that won't be enough time to decipher what's actually happening. So with HIA, you can take them back to the changing rooms and we can perform a SCAT5 test on them, which is a much more vigorous way of, it's pretty much covering all bases as to what a head injury looks like and what the signs and symptoms are. So yeah, it's something that we have definitely improved on, and it's something that needs to sort of be eliminated from sport specifically, because being hurt usually is being injured, but players just want to avoid coming off the pitch. Therefore, they'll say that they're just hurt, they're not injured. The only problem with this is when we look at someone being hurt, there are definitely things within a game where someone can be hurt. Last time I spoke to you guys, we spoke about stingers. Stingers are such a common injury where players don't actually need to come off the pitch most of the time. I said a stat last time where 90% of all stingers go unreported. The players don't actually report them. Pretty much these sort of injuries will happen all the time on the pitch, okay? So we're not just looking at stingers, it can be someone being winded and they're not significant enough to take the player off the pitch. But there is definitely a grey area in between what someone being hurt is and what someone being injured is, which needs to be taken out of sport completely, because at the end of the day, it should be the physio's discretion whether you stay on or not. It shouldn't be up to the coach and it shouldn't be up to the player. So, oh yeah, another big thing to talk about when we talk about someone being hurt is it tends to be just one isolated incident. But when someone's injured, they will go down multiple times in a game. So maybe we've gone on once and they've said it's not significant, I'm fine, they've passed the testing. And then as the game progresses, it gets much worse. So when we go back to looking at a sprained ankle, after that injury occurs, maybe they've passed the tests, I'm then always looking out for them to make sure that they're not hobbling, because we're not just looking at further injury risk at the ankle when a sprained ankle occurs or a rolled ankle. What can happen is you can change the mechanisms of your play to suit the injury. So you could be running in a different manner. When we look at rugby, because your right leg, let's say it was a right leg injury, right ankle's hurt, you then want to put more pressure on your left side. So you'll start tackling with your non-dominant shoulder. And because of that, you might not be used to the contact. You might get your head round the wrong direction. And then just because of a rolled ankle, you then can generate more serious injuries. You can generate, even neck injuries, as I just mentioned. But there's a whole cycle that comes as a result of just one small injury to begin with. Now, why do I think the term hurt and injured is outdated? I think that when we diagnose an injury, or when we say someone's hurt, it can take longer for an injury to develop. When we look at sport, we know that we're in a high adrenaline environment where we're not going to feel the pain straight away. So I can tell someone's injured. They might just see it as them being hurt because of the way they are, because of what's happening within the game. Maybe it's a really close game and they don't want to come off. But this can generate into a long-term injury, which is why it's important to always listen to your physio and for you to understand as a player that the physio is there for your well-being. Now, what I was going to mention as well with the HIA, with the head injury assessment, is I was watching the England Rugby World Cup final from 2003, and the reason that I wanted to speak to you guys about this today was because I watched Mike Tindall in that game on number 12 go in for a tackle, obvious signs of concussion, but back then they didn't have any of these fancy assessment tools that we have now. So the physios were on the pitch for about a minute, and then he was allowed to continue. For me, there was many obvious signs of concussion. He was wobbly on his feet. He couldn't stand up to begin with, had to take time on the ground. When we're a physio, we look for just one sign of concussion. He was showing about 4 or 5. But because injuries weren't taken seriously enough back then, it said to me that I want to talk to you guys about the improvements that have been made up to this point. And it's not just with the physios that we made these improvements. I think coaches now are better understanding that with proper care for their athletes, they can stay on the pitch for longer. Maybe they might have to come off for that specific game, but in the long term, you have less chance of an injury risk, which will benefit the team better, obviously. And when we look at that 2003 World Cup team, we can also see someone like Steve Thompson, who was our hooker, who now suffers with CTE, basically a really serious head injury. Long-term head injuries that he's sustained has led him to get CTE, and as a result of this, he's now suing the RFU, which is why also they've made the developments they've made, and I think more developments need to be made with stuff like HIAs and different things that physios can do to tell a player to come off the pitch, because at the end of the day, I don't want to be told that a player's okay to continue when it's my job to make that distinction. And I think some sports are still in this old-fashioned mindset of if you can run, you're still okay to play, when in a lot of cases that's not the case. So what I wanted to speak to you guys next about is why does this happen? Why do players feel the need to continue after suffering an injury? And it's something that we call sport ethic. So Hughes and Coakley laid out 4 core ideas that underlie what sport ethic is. These 4 are making sacrifices for the game, striving for distinction, accepting risks and playing through pain, and the last one is refusing to accept limits in the pursuit of possibilities. So I'm going to break those down for you a little bit. We're looking at the first one, which is make sacrifices for the game. So most players think to be considered a real athlete, you've got to make these sacrifices. For instance, you staying on the pitch when you don't actually need to, or you definitely shouldn't. You're not a real athlete until you've developed that worthiness within yourself to continue, and that comes from you thinking that you can stay on the pitch for longer. This goes for coaches as well, because a coach will see a player play through injury, and that to them demonstrates an unwavering commitment to the sport, and obviously the coach is going to like that because they like you continuing, but actually for your own safety it's not worth it. Then the second one was striving for distinction. Basically what this means is the ultimate marker of success in sport for athletes is winning, which includes pushing the limits of what they can do, and they feel like playing through injury is one of those ways they can strive for distinction. Next, the third idea was accepting risks and playing through pain. So this basically means any risk involved with sport and playing through pain is something that the athletes have to accept. And playing through pain is both an internal and external force. So it's not just you internally playing through pain, it's to show the coaches that you can do that and you're happy to continue. And it's these pressures that are put on externally which actually lead you to wanting to continue. Then the final idea of underlying sport ethic is that athletes are willing to accept no obstacle while pursuing their sport, even when the odds are against them, for instance, after suffering a debilitating injury. So basically, even if they are seriously injured, they're not going to let that stop them, and they want to continue not only for their own well-doing, but they think they can improve the team's well-doing as well by staying on. But obviously, this can garner a lot of risks as a result. So it's important to note that some examples of overconformity in sport ethic include risking injury to compete, avoiding medical treatment, which is what I mentioned earlier about me coming onto the pitch and the players trying to lie about how well they're actually doing when inside they know they're injured, but they won't show it. Winning regardless of physical costs, playing through pain, avoiding the use of protective gear, and avoiding taping previous injuries. So players saying to themselves that even though they're injured before a game, they're not going to do any form of treatments or anything that could help them not sustain another injury to the area, which is pretty much stupidity in my eyes, because players should be doing everything possible to stay on the pitch, and by avoiding different cares that you can have before a game, this can lead to a much greater risk of injury. So individuals are socialised into playing through pain by parents, coaches, officials and teammates and others involved in sport. Specifically, coaches socialise their players by ignoring their complaints about pain. Teammates do so by downplaying previous injuries and also harassing those that complain about an injury. So I know if you're on a sports team, I've had it before where I didn't want to mention an injury because I didn't want to be frowned upon. This is something that underlies within sport ethic, which I think needs to be changed as well, which is currently changing. You shouldn't have the risk or the worry about talking about an injury in front of your peers because of how it'll make you seem. We should be very transparent with how we're feeling, and this can generate a lot of issues, especially down the line. So I know a lot of gymnasts who this happens to specifically, where they've rolled their ankle or they've sustained an injury during a routine, but because they don't want to let their team down, because they're worried about their placement within the team, they will try and stay on. And this can be a real, concern for us, because we know that these players are risking their livelihood for most of the time for amateur sport, where they won't need to, they're not getting paid for it. It's just something that they have a commitment to their team for. I know you guys probably remember, I can't remember the name of that American gymnast who broke her tibia, and she still went for her next run. I'm gonna have to find the name of that and tag it in the comments, but I'll post a video of that. And that's just showing sport ethic. And basically what I'm trying to say here is this idea that participants have in their heads of them wanting to continue makes the distinction between hurt and injury, because most of the time players do suffer an injury, but they play it off like they're just hurt. And that's pretty much what I wanted to come on here to talk to you guys about. If you have any comments or anything, please stick them in and out so I can speak about that with you. It's been a pleasure speaking to you all, and I'll see you next month.